The Wolf Humanities Center Conference on the Edges of Truth. My name is Ayako Kano. I'm the director of the Wolf Humanities Center. The center was established a little over 25 years ago by Wendy Steiner as University of Pennsylvania's hub for scholarly inquiries as well as public events related to the humanities, what we like to call the thinking arts. And it's a delight to welcome you all here. A couple of thanks are in order for the co-sponsors for this event. I would like to thank the Departments of English, History and Sociology of Science, East Asian Languages and Civilizations, the Center for East Asian Studies, the Program in Global, Medieval, and Renaissance Studies, and the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies for their generous support. And we're also delighted to be in the Kisak Center here in the library, which is one of our favorite spaces. Speaking of spaces, an important housekeeping thing, restrooms are to your left. Go around the corner of the beautiful Lee Library and down the corridor, and you'll see a set of restrooms there. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the organizer of this conference, Dr. Julia Verkholantsev, who will introduce the theme, the topic, and the scope of the conference. Professor Verkholantsev is Associate Professor of Russian and East European Studies here at Penn, and is this year's topic director for the Forum on Truth. She is founder of the Program in Global, Medieval, and Renaissance Studies, and a specialist in medieval and early European cultural and intellectual history of Central and Eastern Europe. So with that, I'll turn things over to Julia.
Hello, good morning. So if you don't like something, blame me as an organizer. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Edges of Truth, Secrecy, Artifice, and the Limits of Knowledge. We began strong with a keynote last night, and today we'll continue this conversation. So although we speak of truth constantly, the concept itself has always been difficult to define. Not only are its boundaries indistinct, but the very idea of truth is polyvalent, as reflected in the many notions set against it: falsehood, error, illusion, secrecy, artifice, manipulation, pretense, fraud. These seemingly marginal categories are in fact vital objects of study, as the keynote lecture made very obvious to us last night. Contemporary debates about truth's opposites are often emotionally charged and lack critical distance. A historical perspective allows us to see more clearly how such tensions structured human relationships and shaped the way people sought to understand their world, record their histories, and control or defend the authority of knowledge. So today, our conference will take this historical perspective and look at various opposites or the rough edges of truth. So a couple of logistic details. We will organize all sessions the same way. So the speakers will first present their papers, and then Q&A will be at the end of the sessions. There are breaks in between. A part of this conference is a wonderful exhibit of manuscripts and rare books in the Lee Library right here on this floor. It will be open during the lunchtime break and during reception at the end of the conference. If you don't yet have the program, all the programs printed with abstracts of talks and biographies of speakers are on the table next to the elevators. And we'll begin with the first session.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, a very good morning to you all. My name is Priyam Namrat, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of South Asia Studies. And first of all, I want to say a big thank you to Ayako and Julia and Sarah and the entire team for organizing this wonderful conference. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the very first panel on constructing knowledge, error, uncertainty, and variation. We have three wonderful speakers here for you today. Our first speaker is Professor Paola Bertucci, Professor of History and History of Medicine and Curator in charge of the History of Science and Technology Division of Peabody Museum at Yale University. She will be speaking to us today on the topic of found in translation, unintentional fabrications, and origin stories in the history of navigation. Welcome, Professor Bertucci.
Very happy to be here. I hope you can all hear me. Thank you, Julia, and all the organizers of this conference for having me. This is the story of a man who never lived, yet existed. Flavio Gioia, the supposed inventor of the mariner's compass, was not a fictional character in the sense of a literary invention. He was brought into existence by a translation mistake in the 16th century. He was regarded as a real citizen of Amalfi in the Kingdom of Naples and credited with the very consequential invention of the mariner's compass, which occurred in 1302. Flavio Gioia's life in print and popular culture spanned centuries and reached even beyond Earth. This case lies squarely at what this conference calls the edges of truth, an error in translation that once in print was institutionally recognized as truth, shaping what was accepted and known about the history of navigation. I will first show how this man was created. I will then discuss how his existence on the printed page contributed to the creation of origin stories that glorified European modernity and the age of conquest, otherwise known as the age of discovery. In recent years, I have been fascinated by the pre-digital alternate realities, i.e. the power of the printed page to create fabrications that went on to have a life of their own. My latest book, In the Land of Marvels, discusses some of these fabricated realities in the context of an 18th century medical controversy that never was, or rather that existed only on the printed page for quite a long time. Today, I discuss a fabrication that uncharacteristically happened by mistake, yet generated narratives that persisted across time and cultures. In this talk, I'm not interested in debunking the myth of Flavio Gioia as the inventor of the nautical compass. This has already been done rigorously and quite convincingly, at least since the 19th century. I am instead interested in the fabricated truth of his existence and how it circulated on the printed page. In the next 20 minutes or so, I will trace Gioia's presence in works that range from early travel literature to historical geography, scientific treatises on navigation and/or magnetism, and reference works like dictionaries and encyclopedias. As Anthony Grafton has reminded us, forgeries can shape learned culture just as powerfully as reliable accounts. Gioia is an unusual case in point. Once created, his mythical figure became almost impossible to dislodge from the history of the mariner's compass. even when his alleged role in the history of navigation was disputed, as we will see. Historical commentators supported or challenged his supposed priority, but it was only in the 19th century that his factual existence was called into question. Even then, and since then, the painstaking process of collecting historical evidence to debunk the myth has proved surprisingly weak in the face of intellectual inertia, nationalistic interests, or scholarly convenience. So here we go with the 3 days steps of creation. First, we are in 1474, when the historian Flavio Biondo publishes a book on Italy, description of Italy, historical geography. When it comes to the city of Amalfi in the Kingdom of Naples, he says, as one of the local curiosities, that in this city, the mariner's compass was perfected sometime in the Middle Ages. Step 2. A humanist, a few decades later, publishes a commentary on Lucretius, Roman poet. And in this text in Latin, he writes about Amalfi, as a footnote, this sentence. This can be translated in 2 ways. One way, which is the correct way, is in Amalfi, in Campania, the compass was invented, as Flavio Biondo, the historian, tells us. It can also be translated as in Amalfi, in Campania, the compass was invented by Flavio. And it is in this second version that this story circulates in another book of historical geography called Description of the Kingdom of Naples, published in 1580 by Scipione Mazzella. Here, Mazzella, after doing some research in the archives to find out who this Flavio was from Amalfi, writes, Amalfi was also the homeland of Flavio Gioia, so he gives us the last name, a noble and famous man who discovered the magnetic compass by which sailors now guide themselves, and this was the time of Charles II, King of Naples, who was a French king, and in memory of so noble an invention, the people of Amalfi were granted as the emblem, the compass, with the Angevin fleur-de-lis marking the north. So here, Flavio Gioia is created. Mazzella set the stage for Amalfi to claim a foundational place in the history of navigation. His formulation was simple but rhetorically potent. The compass was, quote, a glory to the Amalfitans. The claim rapidly entered geographical histories, topographical surveys, and later travel accounts, where Gioia was often mentioned in the same breath as the city of Amalfi itself, one of the curiosities of that land. As Ambler has shown, compilers often worked by excerpting and reproducing existing material rather than verifying it. In the information culture of early modern Europe, abundance and repetition gave even dubious claims extraordinary longevity. Gioia's existence persisted in this context because it fit the genre, an eye-catching curiosity worth repeating. In the century or so following Mazzella, geographical dictionaries and choreographies, when they reached the entry for Amalfi, often included the note that the compass was invented there by a certain Flavio Gioia. Louis Maurery Grand Dictionnaire Historique, first published in 1674 and expanded throughout the 18th century, for instance, reproduced the story precisely this way. Alongside mentions of Amalfi Cathedral, merchants, and maritime laws, Moreri notes that Flavio Gioia invented the compass. In this world, printed world of historical geography, Gioia was part of the local color, an embellishment in the description of a region. The invention of the compass was an Amalfitan point of pride, woven into civic memory and repeated by compilers of geographical lore. Many of them, as you see here. Oops, I need to go back. This repetition across dictionaries and choreographies shows how truths could be constructed through artifice and accumulation. In Blair's terms, abundance itself became a form of authority and error, or better, unintentional fabrication. This became canon through repetition. Flavio Gioia soon came to also inhabit a rather different world, represented in this engraving by Stradanus. Here, the story of the mariner's compass is presented in the context of inventions that marked the transition from antiquity to modernity. So you see here Gioia at work on the invention of the compass, and the caption makes sure viewers get what they're looking at. And this is the second plate in a collection of engravings called Modern Inventions. And you see this is the frontispiece. To the left, we have modernity coming in, pointing to the continent of America, and antiquity going out. And to the right, you have one of the consequential inventions that marked the transition to modernity as the compass. And the compass is credited to Flavius from Amalfi, you see in the engraving around the windrows. So this narrative of progress anchored by inventions would famously be rearticulated in 1620 by Francis Bacon in his New Organon, where he listed the compass along with gunpowder and the printing press as inventions that, quote, changed the whole face and state of things throughout the world. In this framework, origin stories served to mark the path of Europe's triumph over classical antiquity and over cultures that were cast as stagnant or inert. Within this context, Gioia appeared as the man who paved the way for Christopher Columbus, or even as his precursor. Italian scholars like the Abbé Angelo Serravalli placed Gioia within a sort of Trinitarian genealogy that included two other celebrated Italians, Columbus and Vespucci. Their activities brought to the present, Serravalli wrote, the riches and comforts without which Europeans could no longer live. To be fair, Serravalli, writing at the end of the 17th century, was a critical voice that used satire to address the negative impact both on Europe and America of the Columbian crossing. But other Italian authors adopted a different tone. In 1785, Giovanni Bernardino Tafuri wrote historical treatise on the newly found sciences and arts. He was a Neapolitan historian, and he maintained the art of navigation finally came to perfection with the invention of the nautical compass, made by the Amalfitan Flavio Gioia in the year 1302. Truly a marvelous invention, worthy of remembrance for all time, which brought immense advantage to commerce and not a little glory to Italy itself, which may boast of having produced it. Tafuri then traced the line from Gioia to Columbus, fusing Italian invention with European expansion. In his narrative, Gioia's compass is the hinge between ancient ignorance and the modern world revealed by Columbus. This narrative constructing a genealogical line linking Gioia and Columbus spread beyond Italian scholars. In 1777, William Robertson wrote his History of America, in which he presented the mariner's compass as the technological breakthrough that gave Europeans mastery over the sea, leading to the conquest of American lands. Robertson explained that mariners, once bound to coastal sailing, could now navigate by night and under clouds. The compass, he wrote, quote, opened to man the dominion of the sea and put him in full possession of the earth. He then credited Flavio Gioia of Amalfi as the author of this great discovery. Although he acknowledged that historians knew little about Gioia himself, Robertson nonetheless made him the symbolic benefactor whose invention enabled Columbus's voyage. In this way, Gioia, the compass, and America are linked in a teleological chain, an Italian invention leading to European prowess at sea, culminating in the epochal transformation of world history through the Columbian crossing. Such a place of honor inevitably provoked contestation. No longer a local curiosity, Gioia's increased reputation as the first spark of Europe's colonial expansion elicited historical research leading to alternative genealogies. By the late 17th century, compilers of technical dictionaries and encyclopedias began to question Gioia's priority and began to argue for their own national priority. French scholars, for example, noted that the fleur-de-lis marking the north in virtually all windroses of the period, they noted that the fleur-de-lis was evidence of French priority. This is the symbol of France, and it is on the windrose because, in fact, the French invented the mariner's compass. They also mentioned the 12th century French poet Guyot de Provins, who included a reference to a device similar to the mariner's compass. This, they noted, was well before the times of Gioia. This opportunity for French pride was soon appropriated in other texts that I'm happy to discuss later. English lexicographic and antiquarian literature operated a similar appropriation. The mariner's compass is called bussola in Italian and boussole in French. English authors of the late 17th and 18th centuries advanced the claim that the very word box in English, or boxel, indicated the English origin of the compass. Just as Alexander becomes Alessandro in Italian, they argued, so bussola derived from boxo. The polymath Domenico Alberto Azzuni ridiculed this etymological fantasy, reminding his readers that the Italian term bossolo for wood case was already in place. But the persistence of all these stories shows the intensity of national rivalries. The polemic was bound up with the broader debate about Italy's cultural authority in the colonial age. Not surprisingly, the authors most involved with finding historical sources to overturn the story of Gioia's invention were Spanish. The Jesuit scholar Francisco Javier Lampias in 1780 argued that the compass was in fact an Arab invention. In his telling, Italians couldn't claim the glory of the New World because the compass itself was the work of the Arabs. Even more tellingly, oh, sorry, this is the quotation from, even more tellingly, Antonio de Capmany, which you're looking at actually now in this slide, in 1792 subjected the story of the introduction of the mariner's compass to archival scrutiny. He noted that while systematic writers credited Gioia, Barcelona's maritime records from 1331 and 1364 contained no mention of the compass. So on ships, the records, you couldn't find any data about the compass. Only in the 15th century did the compass appear in Aragonese royal registers. His point was methodological. Patriotic lore must yield to the testimony of documents. The mariner's compass changed the course of European navigation only when it became widely used aboard ships, which happened, as the records demonstrated, only in the 15th century. The arc of time between Gioia and Columbus was too long to connect the two, argued Capmany. So in this sense, he and other Spanish authors represent what Grafton would call critics confronting what they thought was a historical forgery. Yet they remained blind to the actual historical fabrication leading to this pre-digital hallucination represented by Flavio Gioia. Capmany thus marks a turning point in this history, in this story. He embodies the historian as critic, armed with archival evidence to confront patriotic lore, yet even his rigor could not erase Gioia. This disjunction between scholarly method and the resilience of fabrication is where we most clearly see the limits of knowledge in these early modern information cultures. In all these cases, while Gioia's priority was disputed, his existence was never called into question. Whereas historical geographies mentioned Gioia as a local curiosity, in texts on the history of navigation, the priority over the compass was a sensitive topic and touched on national pride. It was not the existence of Gioia that these authors intended to challenge. It was the role of Italy versus France versus Britain versus Spain in the history of open sea navigation and the New World Order that followed the Columbian encounter. By the mid-18th century, these disputes over the compass were also refracted through the most ambitious project of the Enlightenment, the Encyclopédie, that treated the compass not as a local curiosity, but as an invention whose origins were contested across nations and civilizations. The article Boussole rehearsed the various claims, Italian, French, English, Arab, and also Chinese, without definitely resolving them. The emphasis was less on establishing certainty than on mapping the field of competing authorities, which in itself was a statement about the professional and constructed nature of knowledge. Now, the reference to China that we find here was not invented by the author of the article for the Encyclopédie. It actually constituted a counter-narrative that gained traction in the first half of the 18th century, especially in France, thanks to the Jesuit Jean-Baptiste Duhalde that wrote this monumental description of China in 1736. Duald emphasized that the compass, the printing press, and gunpowder, the three great inventions of modernity, were all Chinese in origin. Various scholars have shown how China functioned in the Enlightenment imagination as both an object of admiration and a foil for Europe's claim to modernity. In the case of the compass, this meant affirming Chinese priority, while simultaneously insisting that only Europe had developed the capacity for continuous improvement. Let me give you one example. Voltaire, in his more Sinophile phase, had already pointed to the Chinese inventions that compelled to reconsider claims to European priority. For Voltaire, however, the acknowledgement of Chinese antiquity was a way of relativizing European exceptionalism while still preserving the claim that progress, in its continuous sense, was Europe's achievement. So, in one of his essays, the essay on the costumes, he acknowledged that the Chinese had known the compass for much longer than the Europeans. Yet, he indicated Flavio Gioia as the inventor of the mariner's compass. He explained that the Chinese considered the compass a mere curiosity, and so they missed the opportunity to turn it into an engine of modernity. Duald himself maintained that gunpowder, the compass, and the printing press had all been perfected in Europe. Athanasius Kircher, already in the 17th century, had insisted that the Chinese used the compass only for geomancy and not for navigation. By the 18th century, this argument had become a standard defense of European priority. Azzuni himself, the one who ridiculed the English etymology, etymological fantasy, devoted an extended section of his 1795 treatise on the mariner's compass to rejecting Chinese claims, the claims about China. So you see, one of the chapters is entitled, "The Chinese did not have the nautical compass before the Europeans." Azzuni found a compromise, say, in a tripartite genealogy. The compass was invented in France, reformed in Amalfi, and perfected, and this will surprise all of you, in Portugal. In his account, Gioia's contribution was to suspend the needle on a pivot, introduce the windrose, and put the compass in a case. In a wood case. Gioia is acknowledged, but as a reformer rather than the inventor. The Chinese counter-narrative situates Gioia within a global context of knowledge, invention, and progress. Historical truth here was not stable but contested, reimagined across cultures, and refracted through both admiration and polemic. So to conclude, whether celebrated or contested, Flavio Gioia lived a long life on the printed page. He was invoked as a local curiosity, a symbol of Italian pride, a forerunner of Columbus, a pawn in national rivalries, and a counterpoint in debates over Chinese antiquity. His name endured into the 19th and 20th century, carved into monuments, enshrined in encyclopedias, and even given to a crater on the moon. And this is the official European Space Agency entry for the crater. When the fourth centennial of Columbus' 1492 voyage was in the works, the story of Gioia re-emerged as an Italian badge of honor. A statue was commissioned. It was sent to the Paris Expo in 1902, where the statue got a gold medal. The voices of scholars who collected compelling evidence against the myth of Gioia were systematically ignored. Italy had been recently unified, 1861, and needed a national heroes. The statue was eventually installed in Amalfi, where I understand still is, even though there are rumors that it has been recently removed, in 1926, during the fascist regime. The story of Flavio Gioia demonstrates the extraordinary capacity of print to generate alternate realities. Once in circulation, these realities came to be absorbed into civic pride, national competition, and global historiography. Even when painstaking archival research dismantled the claim, the printed figure of Gioia endured, copied and recopied across centuries. In Adrian Jones' terms, print did not guarantee truth, but it guaranteed durability. Fabricated realities like Gioia's are remarkably resilient. They survive debunking, however rigorous, and continue to shape how societies imagine their past, their progress, and their place in the world. So I take questions now? Okay.
Thank you, Professor Bertucci, for that insightful and engaging presentation. Next up, it's my delight to welcome my wonderful colleague and fellow doctoral candidate, Eleanor Webb, from the Department of History here in the University of Pennsylvania. And Eleanor will be speaking on uncertain signs, the signs of physiognomy in early modern Italy. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you for the organizers. So do I use this to? Okay. So I'll just get right into it. In the 3rd century BC, a peripatetic author, later erroneously identified as Aristotle, made a claim that became central to later reflections on the discipline of physiognomy. That is, no animal exists with the physical form of one, but the disposition of another. There is nothing that looks like a lion that is not also fierce and brave, for example. Skip to the 1540s in Italy, Girolamo Cardano, a mathematician, astrologer, and professor of medicine at the University of Pavia, made the same claim in very different terms. There has never, he said, been an evil person who entirely lacked evil and constant signs, nor an honest person who has been stained by them. Ideas about method and goals in this discipline vary widely from its origins in ancient Mesopotamia through Greco-Roman antiquity, the Arabic and Latin Middle Ages, and on into the early modern period. Yet there endured a single common understanding, that inscribed on the human body, and the face in particular, are visible signs that, if read correctly, reveal otherwise invisible but potent truths about individual character, disposition, and even destiny. While the pseudo-Aristotle and many long after him, as we can see, were concerned with codifying character types based on animal analogies, Cardano made clear his interest was motivated by issues of morality, deception, and in particular, the misleading potential of language. People lie or omit the truth, he says. Their faces do not. For this reason, Cardano was particularly interested in the practice of metaposcopy, which he and others conceived of as a sub-branch and, in fact, the most important part of physiognomy. Metaposcopy focused attention on reading the lines of the forehead. According to Cardano, the forehead exhibits, for all the world to see, the influence of three fundamental forces acting upon human life: nature, time, and the will, the human will, free will. An individual has to some extent control over muscles of the forehead, and over time these movements of frowning or smiling create lines that eventually, as we all know, become an index of one's life, whether it was happy or sad, he says, or whether you were a kind or a mean person. Importantly, the operation of the will is not absolute here. More often than not, the forehead in fact moves involuntarily and reveals our true thoughts and emotions, even when we may want to hide them. Yet Cardano points out there are other lines on the forehead that are not dependent on either kinds of contractions at all, but are simply there and different in different people. It is these lines that Cardano says are inscribed by nature as signs, indicating not just character and aptitudes, but also destiny. The forehead bears forth this information and is in this sense uniquely impervious to deception. Today, taking Cardano's lead, I will focus on a particular branch of a much broader flourishing of interest in physiognomy among university circles in 16th and 17th century Italy. As Tamsin Barton pointed out in her study of the ancient techne, as she described it, of physiognomy, it is an art that continually resurfaces and is constantly reinvented to suit the social, political, and intellectual demands of the given present. So I'm going to try and illuminate some aspects of how physiognomy was reinvented or reconstituted in early modern Italy in accordance with that society's own particular set of demands. I'm also going to make a reference to Anthony Grafton, who studied Cardano as an astrologer and points out that historians have to kind of repeatedly avoid or be aware of falling into the trap of seeing methods and assumptions expressed by astrologers as somehow new. And I think this is also true of physiognomy and metaposcopy, but it is possible, I think, to describe how within this kind of ancient set of assumptions and methods, different people at different times emphasize and frame them differently, and to explain how and why this framing was persuasive and powerful in that particular moment. Okay. So I will do so through discussion of these three works. The first being Cardano's, which he wrote in the 1540s and circulated and revised in manuscript throughout his career in Pavia and Bologna, but which was not published until well after his death in 1658 and in Paris rather than in Italy. The second was written in the 1590s by the renowned astronomer and professor of mathematics Giovanni Antonio Magini, who gathered around himself a close-knit group of students who, after his death, established an academy in Bologna called the Accademia dei Vespertini, and worked together there to produce the third text. This work took its lead from Cardano and Magini in particular, but succeeded in what both these authors had tried but failed to achieve. It was published in their own lifetime. These works adapt their approach according to both broader intellectual debates ongoing at the time, as well as the forces of encroaching religious censorship. So my argument is going to be threefold. The first two relate to the first two manuscripts, and then the last to the printed text. First, in the 16th century, authors argued for the value of the system of signs metaposcopy offered, precisely because it bypassed the corrupting and obscuring tendencies of language. They were able to do so convincingly, and this is the second aspect of my argument, by presenting metaposcopy and physiognomy more broadly as forms of analysis that were essentially mathematical, and thus drawing on a growing prestige the discipline of mathematics was experiencing at the time. The issue of language will return in the last section of my talk as I turn to the published text, where we will see how its authors adopted the rhetoric of Catholic censorship in order to carve out a space for physiognomy within the shifting boundaries of legitimate knowledge. In tracing these strategies, I hope to show that this seemingly marginal discipline was in fact a key arena in which ideas about certainty, evidence, and legitimacy and knowledge were worked out and debated. But first, what is metaposcopy and physiognomy, and how do they fit within the broader system of knowledge taught in universities in this period? So, both physiognomy and metaposcopy were at their base efforts to codify a system of signs according to a basic set of assumptions that undergirded the connected practices of medicine and astrology. Students of medicine learned that medical practice was one of identifying and interpreting a series of signs in their patients. No single sign, sign they were taught was clear and certain in isolation and could deceive by pointing to a myriad of possible conclusions. They therefore relied on groups of signs or syndromes and to relative degrees accepted that their diagnoses and prognoses were always less rigorous or certain than those attained by other disciplines. Physicians were aided in their task of interpreting these physical signs by a structural framework offered by astrology. Correspondence between the celestial and terrestrial spheres was a fundamental premise of early modern medical astrology. Galenic and Hippocratic theories closely tied bodily changes to celestial influences, which operated according to seemingly clear, observable, and predictable motions and conjunctions. Students of medicine therefore took classes in astrology, and some physicians, like Cardano, were renowned for their astrological skills, providing patients with astrological as well as medical counsel. Physiognomy and metaposcopy offered another system of science that was closely connected to this medical astrological framework, but directed at moral rather than medical diagnosis. Practitioners of metaposcopy in particular codified the lines on the forehead according to their relationship with specific planetary bodies, and argued that one could determine the relative influence of these planets on character, disposition, destiny, according to the length, depth, shape, and intersection of said lines. Okay, so how do we explain the kind of growth and interest in attention paid to metaposcopy in the 16th century among these university circles? So, the work of searching for new and better editions of classical texts throughout the 15th century had, by the turn of the 16th, led to a growing awareness of the contingency of language, and of Latin in particular. At the time Cardano was writing, scholars, including many with whom he was acquainted, like Pietro Pomponazzi and Speroni, had leveled a strong critique against university education by arguing that the vehicle used to express and produce knowledge there, the Latin language, could obscure and corrupt as much as it could illuminate. While other scholars turned to the vernacular as a solution to what they saw as this irredeemable corruption of Latin, publishing vernacular versions of some of the most important philosophical texts, the proper way to respond to this issue was not a given. Now, I don't want to overplay the mistrust in language in this period, of course, but I do think that attention to alternative semiotic systems was at least in part motivated by this context. Metaposcopy offered an alternative system of signs that made sense within an existing and received body of knowledge, but had the advantage of bypassing, to a certain extent, language itself. Cardano outlined a kind of alphabet of signs, and did Magini after him, and organized them in relation to one another as if they represented their own grammar. Signs, like nouns, could be proper or common. They also had a relationship to time, not unlike tenses. Quote, "At times, the lines increase and grow, signifying effects and future events. At other times, they diminish and decrease, when they signify decline and things already past. But when the line remains in its own proper state, it signifies an enduring and perpetual effect," unquote. While signs can be single, like letters, and arranged in combinations, like words and sentences, with differences, however subtle in arrangement, signifying differences in meaning, the parallels to language analysis are not very often made explicit by either Cardano or by Magini. What is explicit in their works and in the final printed text are their authors' concern with the very live issue of language in the social sense as a vehicle of potential deception, and language in an ontological sense as in a state of high corruption, such that it is a less than reliable means of describing physical reality. Now, this notion of an alternative language in which reality and the physical world might be more accurately described echoes a broader epistemological shift that took place in the course of the 16th century, and that we see expressed most explicitly in Magini's work on metaposcopy. This is to do with mathematics. Since the Middle Ages, mathematics was taught at universities alongside astronomy and astrology, and primarily as a tool with lesser status for the higher study of celestial spheres. During the 16th century, the ties that bound this long-standing trinity of disciplines began to unravel. Prompted by both textual recovery of Greek mathematical texts and the practical needs of warfare, practitioners of mathematics began to make more expansive claims for the epistemological and practical value of their discipline. Scholars such as Francesco Barozzi and Magini himself began arguing that mathematics, or a mathematical language, offered the purest and most expansive means for describing both physical realities and expressing rational ideas. At the same time, in this period, the legitimacy of astrological study, the making of predictions based on the stars, faced renewed scrutiny from both scholars and church authorities, and was progressively excluded over the course of the 17th century from university teaching. While many mathematicians began to distance their discipline from the apparent infection of astrology, others, including Maggini, sought to reform astrology by means of further integrating it with mathematical practice. Maggini's work on metaposcopy can be understood as part of this broader effort to defend astrology and other predictive disciplines by reforming them according to more explicitly precise practices of observation, measurement, and mathematical calculation. In his preface, he declares that, quote, number is the principal foundation of order by which the universe is structured, enclosing all within itself. He presents metaposcopy in Pythagorean terms. Proportions on the face are not only a convenient device to calculate relationships among measurable objects, but are fundamental to the composition and order of the world. In other words, number is the key to making sense of both the physical reality of man and of his embeddedness in an interconnected universe. Such connections, Maggini tells us, can no longer be based on the conjectural series of loosely codified signs that had kind of characterized the discipline before him, but, he says, be rooted in rigorous practices of precise measurement and calculation. He even recommends using a compass to measure facial proportions and to map the 5 horizontal zones of the forehead. Based on these measurements, one can make firm and reliable predictions about future destinies, which he proceeds to do through a massive tome of observational study. This manuscript, including, there's kind of several versions of it, but one of them includes over 2,000 heads with accompanying analysis and clear instruction on methods of measurement, comparison, and data collection. Both he and Cardano before him had stressed the need to collect as many examples from observation and experience as possible and subject them to rigorous and consistent practices of mathematical analysis. So I should have put a picture of a broader page, but I just want to go through some of these images. So there's, they're laid out as 4 heads per page, so 8 on a kind of spread. And the extent of these works, like I said, one of them has 2,000 heads. Cardano's manuscript has 800 heads, so they're quite large. I think it's almost certain that these manuscripts were put together collaboratively. In many of these manuscripts, the heads are printed and then annotated by hand with ink with the specific lines and their corresponding significance. There is a notable similarity here with the construction of mathematical texts in the same period, including Maggini's, in which students were involved in the production of the many diagrams and figures that illustrated a text written by their professor. So I think it's highly likely that Maggini was assisted in the production of this large work by his students, who, as we know, were interested in the discipline. It also strikes me as an aside when I was going through some of these heads, as I come to call them, that a lot of the same issues will come up over and over again, and that they could be really valuable sources for kind of social or emotional history, and like the kinds of things that people were particularly worried about at any given time. So I think death by plague is a very unsurprising one in this context. There's a lot of concern about being killed by your horse or your parents. And people were not only interested in learning how to recognize these possibilities in their own faces and their own futures, but how to identify characteristics in others. So this is about how many wives someone might have. I don't know if this is good or bad. And this is identifying a murderer and kind of a devious man, a liar. So I think many of these concerns about love, money, death, and social relations are a good reminder to kind of come back to the enduring aspects of these disciplines and the essentially contingent and rhetorical nature of their framing in any given moment. Now I want to turn, one last one. Now I want to turn to the last of our works, and the only one that was printed in its author's lifetime. This is a wide-ranging handbook of physiognomy written in Bologna entitled Cephalogia Physiognomica. This work is over 600 pages long and is made up of 100 chapters or heads divided into 10 books. Each book focuses on a different part of the head, the forehead being the most important part of the subject, eyebrows, eyes, lips, hair, and so on. And the final chapter of each book turns specifically to female features. It was produced, and as its single-named author, Cornelio Ghirardelli, tells us, initially intended for private circulation within the context of the Accademia dei Vespertini in Bologna in the late 1620s. This academy had been established in 1624 by a group of former students of Giovanni Antonio Magini. In fact, while Ghirardelli is, like I said, the only named author of the work, it was actually co-written by Ovidio Moltobani, who had been Magini's student and who went on to hold a chair in mathematics at the university. Moltobani used his academy pseudonym, the Quiet One, to author additions to Ghirardelli's observations, and was joined by more than 80 additional contributors from the academy and from across Italy, some of whom are also identified only through pseudonyms, who composed poems to accompany each of the 100 demonstrative engravings. Now, as the pseudonyms might indicate, the group and broader contributors were acutely conscious of the growing scrutiny and danger of producing knowledge pertaining to physiognomy in this period. Now, in 1586, Pope Sixtus V had issued the first papal bull that targeted predictive disciplines directly, while carving out a permissible space for quote-unquote natural astrology pertaining to medicine, agriculture, and navigation. Judicial astrology and other disciplines that purported to predict the future were problematic for the church in two ways. In producing predictions about individual lives, astrologers claimed to know things that were the privilege of God's infinite foresight. They also ascribed to the stars matters that depended on individual free will, and thus undermined this doctrine and that of individual ethical responsibility. Now, anyone that knows anything about the period, these are very charged issues, given the religious context. When the Tribunal of the Holy Office seized Magini's entire library of astrological works from his students, who he had kind of left them to in 1625, the growing pressure on this group, who were committed in several ways to upholding his intellectual legacy, must have seemed even more acute. Now, it's important to say that physiognomy, metoposcopy have a kind of very arbitrary place within the church decrees, and Ghirardelli spends some time in the middle of the book going through each various kind of iteration of and different statements about the discipline in particular, and making clear that what he's doing is actually allowed. But I would like to argue, aside from that the Cefalogia indicates several ways in which extra-university groups like the Vespertini sought to navigate this censorship environment and carve out an enduring space of permissibility for beleaguered subjects like astrology and physiognomy, which they continued to see as both legitimate and useful. Throughout the text, we will find repeated emphasis that the observations are purely natural, meaning they deal with physical phenomena like climate and the environment, and not kind of straying into the realm of judicial astrology. But this kind of framing was a deliberate rhetorical strategy that involved adopting the language of censorship and applying it to the same set of predictions that had previously been framed quite differently. We see an awareness of the advantage and possibility of this framing and the kind of artificial nature of some of this framing 30 years earlier, when Magini had tried and failed to get his own work on metoposcopy published. He wrote to Giambattista della Porta, who is like one of the most famous authors on physiognomy in this period, encouraging him to frame the context of his own work on metoposcopy, which was never published, in terms of, quote, nature and contingency, so as to avoid excessive scrutiny of the work by church authorities. Or rather, he says, Della Porta should publish it in Germany and avoid church censorship altogether, which is also a route that obviously people took. We also find in this text an emphasis that became common among mathematicians at the time, who stressed their use of a language of ease and accessibility. Like these mathematicians, the Cefalogia argues that because the practices of observation, measurement, and calculation spoke for themselves, a plain, vernacular, even local language stripped of any adornment was sufficient. In other words, it employs a kind of rhetoric that denies it is rhetoric at all. Another, more subtle strategy that I think was in play involved the pseudonyms. Moltobani used his pseudonym associated with his membership at the Vespertini to contribute his editions. What's striking is that he never used this particular pseudonym anywhere else, and it took quite a bit of detective work in surviving Academy letters to confirm that he was the author. Now, it's important to point out that pseudonyms are very common and kind of playful aspect of Academy membership in this period, but Moltobani, for example, would use pseudonyms eventually in an official capacity, which is the only instance that I've done, that I've seen that, in publishing the astrological almanac for the university, which is a requirement, but he used a pseudonym in order to avoid kind of pushback later on in the 17th century. My sense is that the use of the pseudonym was a form of self-protection and a way of insulating himself from potential fallout if the work ever came under attack. And I think this is also true later of his university publications. Moltobani was joined in using a pseudonym by more than 30 of the poetic contributors. Oh, I forgot that one. Okay, which brings me to the role that poetry plays in the broader work. In his introduction, Ghirardelli is quick to clarify that the Cephalogia includes, quote, many things presented in the manner of poets, destiny, fortune, fate, heaven, and so on, unquote. But that none of this should be taken as undermining the, quote, pure candor of our holy faith, unquote. We find this same kind of disclaimer in several collections of poetry published by this group and a related one of which states that if any lines of poetry, quote, smack of Gentileness, unquote, readers should remember that the authors were, quote, born, lived, and died Catholics, unquote. Another tells readers that terms like fate, destiny, deity, paradise are used, quote, only as poetry, unquote. Now, this was particularly striking to me as authors of vernacular poetry, and especially those active in academies throughout the 16th and early 17th century, had, throughout this period, spent much of their time arguing for the conceptual and philosophical value and truth of the poetry to which they devoted their time studying and composing. When I started looking closely at the Cephalogia's poetry, especially the anonymous ones, I realized that they're often bolder in their claims than the prose. While Ghirardelli and Moltobani carefully frame their physiognomic observations as natural, as we know, the poetry is far less hesitant and uses languages and constructions that suggest meanings clearly contradictory to the decrees of the church. One dedicatory poem asks, quote, what shall be the face of future times? And concludes that the book, quote, reveals the shadows of life and the signs of death, unquote. Another declares, quote, by a fatal law, it has always followed that an impure appearance reveals an impure soul, unquote. Another, that the face is, quote, like a clear glass, unquote, and the particular face at hand spoke to a, quote, certain end of treachery by his own hand, unquote. Perhaps most tellingly, the poetry, despite Ghirardelli's disclaimers, became the most lasting part of the Cephalogia. Later editions dropped all the prose and preserved only the poems. So while poetry was officially downplayed as mere ornament, it was in practice the main vehicle for sustaining and transmitting this kind of knowledge. Ghirardelli's protest may therefore have been less about what poetry is and more about what it was strategically useful to say poetry was in a time of censorship. So to conclude, I think I have found in my encounter with these works sharp and explicit evidence of the process by which authors consciously sought to produce knowledge according to the full gamut of forces we know to shape the endeavor. These include concerns with establishing and organizing evidence and proof, an eye to utility, which is also an attention to the primary social or emotional concerns of the reader, and the possibility of censorship and the ways they could use language that could be acceptable to censoring authorities. Now, I want to jump forward many years, and this is something that I came across while I was researching these topics. And I don't want to claim that there's like a direct line between physiognomy and phrenology and facial inference, AI facial inference, which is it's being called. But I don't think the line is a particularly meandering one either. This technology, which is promoted as aiding employers by providing, quote, paralanguage information, unquote, on facial expressions, gestures, and tone of voice, is based very explicitly on a lack of confidence that interviewers can effectively judge candidates based simply on what they say. That language has the potential to obscure, deceive, or be subject to conflicting interpretations. And that, in turn, more reliable, direct information about people might be accessible by codifying a system of signs on the face. Now, I'm being a little provocative, but it does seem to me that the rhetoric of rationality and objectivity around technologies such as this is merely a new take on a very old impulse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that wonderful presentation. And finally, to round off this panel, we have Professor Darin Hayton, Associate Professor of History of Science at Haverford College. And he will be speaking today on astrological aphorisms and the many ways the universe worked. Welcome, Professor Hayton.
Thank you for coming today, this morning. I am not used to, I don't tend to do slides. I'm a bit of a Luddite, and I think you should have something to take with you. Sadly, I didn't expect so many people, so not all of you will get something. But please, if you don't get one, just leave out on a souvenir.
I can make some more copies. Thanks.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Double-sided. It's not essential, but it's something to doodle on. And I'll give a second for those to meander out. Had I known we were going to have the talk on physiognomy, I would have picked a different aphorism. There's a great aphorism in this collection of aphorisms that talks about how if the native, the person for whom a chart is cast, has Mars in a particular place in the chart, that native will have a particular type of scar on his forehead. Alas, I didn't know you were going to be talking about physiognomy in this way, so I didn't include that. Yep. I will lean forward, I promise. Okay, I'm going to assume, and if I'm mistaken, I will be pleasantly surprised. I'm going to assume that you do not regularly read collections of astrological aphorisms, that most of you don't have the collection attributed to Ptolemy on your nightstand, and so I thought it might be useful to see a few of them so that we get an understanding, a shared understanding of the type of statement and the form of text that will occupy us for the next few minutes. Here, and these I've reproduced at the top of the handout, here are 5 that typically appear as aphorisms 16 through 20. They're not usually numbered, but 16 through 20 in the Greek tradition. And I will be talking mostly about the Greek tradition. When the benefics rule the 8th house, they cause damage to good men, but if they are made good, they depart from this. When you forecast about a particular life of an old man, do not first forecast before you have measured how long it is possible that he still lives. When the 2 luminaries, that is the sun and the moon, are in a single minute, and also a benefic is in the ascendant, the native will be fortunate in all things that come his way, just as also if they oppose each other from the ascendant and from the descendant. But if a malefic is on the ascendant, suspect the opposite. The effect of purification is dulled or diminished when the moon is in conjunction with Jupiter. Do not touch a part of the body with iron when the moon is in the sign that rules that part of the body. When the moon is in Scorpio or in Pisces, and the Lord of the ascendant is in conjunction with a star that is underneath the earth, the purge will work well. But if it is in conjunction with a star, here the Lord of the ascendant, is in conjunction with a star that is above the earth, he, having drunk the purgative, will vomit it up. Obviously riveting reads. If you have the handout, some clarifications here. See if I have a copy of it up for myself. On the back is a fairly common pre-modern, empty but pre-modern astrological chart. And I want to draw attention to some of the pieces here. I've numbered the houses 1 through 12 as they would typically be numbered. The 8th house is marked over here in the sort of upper right. It is mentioned in one of these aphorisms. The ascendant is over on the left, marked with house 1. It's the angle that comes up this way. The descendant is on 7 on the other side. If you imagine this as a chart that represents the heavens and space, houses 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 would have been below the earth, and the remaining houses would be above the earth. So when we're looking for the Lord of the Ascendant, which is the planet that rules this part of the house over here, when we're looking for the Lord of the Ascendant in conjunction with something below the earth, it would be a star down here, or above the earth, it would be a star up here. These 5 aphorisms I just read come from the circa 100 aphorisms that circulated under Ptolemy's name. Perhaps best known in the Latin title, by the Latin title, the Centoloquium. I will be referring to it by its Greek name, Ho Karpos, because I'm interested today in the Greek tradition. While some of the aphorisms are statements about the nature of astrology, most are instructions about how to practice astrology and principles about the science itself, how the natural world works. We're going to come back to aphorism 21 in a moment, so we'll see that's at the core of one of the problems. But I want to ask a couple of questions. If aphorisms are, in fact, as they seem to be, statements about how the world works, how are we to understand aphorisms that vary across copies? How are we to understand aphorisms that perhaps vary across a particular text? What do we do when we encounter 2 contradictory statements about how the world works? How do we deal with and try to resolve or accommodate these seeming contradictions? And what are the consequences for us as historians? What are the consequences for our practices? Collections of Ptolemy's aphorisms circulated widely in pre-modern Europe in Arabic, Latin, Greek, and later in the vernaculars. We can get a sense of the text's popularity and reach from the number of surviving manuscripts. In the Latin tradition, it was one of the most widely copied astrological texts in the Middle Ages. There are at least 199 complete Latin copies that survive in various translations, usually from the Arabic, but sometimes from the Greek. And these date from the 12th through the 15th century. The Latin tradition by the late 15th and early 16th century finds its way into print. And then we have just a multiplication of these texts. The Greek tradition, there are at least 60 complete copies of the Ptolemy's aphorisms that survive, as well as a number of copies of excerpts, usually something in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 dozen aphorisms that have been pulled out of the collection of 100, sometimes in order, sometimes in what appears to be a random order, perhaps for the owner's use or, as I've come to think of it, amusement. The Greek texts date from the surviving Greek texts date from slightly later, the early 13th century, through the heyday of the 14th and 15th century, and a few as late as the 17th century. We tend to find the Greek copies and codices that contain other astrological works, medical works, and texts on natural philosophy, many attributed to some actually by Aristotle and others attributed to Aristotle. These codices are working texts, often showing considerable evidence of reader or copyist intervention in the form of scholia, interlinear glosses or translations, and marginal annotations. There's one Greek copy that I've found that seems to be deviate from this. It's a small, quite nice looking copy in the National Library in Austria that has a selection of Hippocrates' aphorisms and then the collection of Ptolemy's. And those are the only 2 texts in that codex. I should add a caveat here before I wander down this path much further. I am radically, that is to say, completely uninterested in engaging with debates about who actually composed these aphorisms. There's a really rich literature on arguing about whether it's an Arabic text composition, a Greek composition. Nobody thinks it's actually a Latin composition, but there are people who are deeply concerned about who the author was and when and where it was composed. I am uninterested in those things. I'm also uninterested, to pick up on Michael Gordon's comment or term yesterday, when the term pseudo gets added to Ptolemy in the attribution of this text. For my purposes, the people I'm studying and the periods I'm studying, it was a Ptolemaic text by Ptolemy. I will say parenthetically, the earliest reference I have to somebody doubting that it might be by Ptolemy is in the 1620, the first edition of Robert Burton's Anatomy and Melancholy, when he's rehearsing some of the sources for melancholy, and he cites a handful of authors of collections of astrological aphorisms, and he has this sort of throwaway comment that can be, it's a very brief, so it can be construed in a couple of ways. He talks about, or whoever might have written the collection of aphorisms. And I say it's a throwaway comment and ambiguous because he might be referring to whichever collection of aphorisms you're looking at that might have different authorship, or he might be saying, or whoever was the author of this sort of canonical collection of aphorisms. But again, I'm not here interested in that. I want to turn my attention to the collection of aphorisms, and I want to look at four. I raised questions about what do we do when we have contradictions. I want to think about four specific types of contradictions we find in these collections of aphorisms. One is where the zodiacal sign varies. The aphorism is otherwise identical, but the cause is attributed to a different sign. One is where the aspects, that is the interplanetary relationships, geometric relationships, vary. A third is when the planet itself varies. So if we substitute Mars, as we will see, for the sun, what happens? And then finally, there are instances where multiple pieces of this vary. So sign and planet, or sign and aspect. Let's start with aphorism 21, which you've got on front of you. It nicely illustrates the problem of signs, or the variation in signs. In one 14th century, I should say all these translations are mine from the texts I'm talking about. So the six that I gave you are my translations of a manuscript that, 15th century manuscript that is in Paris. There's a 14th century copy that echoes in many ways what we just saw. Says, aphorism 21 says, when the moon is in Scorpio or in Pisces, and the Lord of the Ascendant is in conjunction with a star that is under the earth, the purge will work well. But if it is in conjunction with a star that is above the earth, he, having drunk the purgative, will vomit it up. Here, it's this top, if you want to work on your Greek paleography, it's the top illustration. And I've circled, I'll put a little square around the sign for Scorpio, the symbol for Scorpio. In another version, also from the 14th century, this one in Paris, and it's the middle of the examples on the handout, the aphorism says, when the moon is in Cancer or in Pisces, and the Lord of the Ascendant is in conjunction with a star that is under the earth, and so on and so forth. And yet a third, which is also there, we see Cancer again being invoked as the sign that is relevant, and this time Cancer is written out as opposed to its symbol. The difference here is that sign, that second sign. First sign, Scorpio or Cancer. At first glance, we might think, well, what does it matter? They are both, after all, as we all know, right? We all know this. They're watery signs. They're in the watery, in the water triplicity. They are both thought to be cold and dry, moist and dry, moist and cold, excuse me. But they are very different in almost every other way. The moon, which is our relevant planet here, is actually the lord of Cancer, has dominion in Cancer. Its effects would be augmented in Cancer and enhanced. The moon, by contrast, is diminished in Scorpio. Its effects are going to be reduced. Its effects will be relegated. So when we shift Cancer and Scorpio, Scorpio is also a fixed sign, Cancer is a movable sign. I could go down a long list of astrological differences, but when we shift Scorpio for Cancer, we are actually making a very strong claim about the way the world works, and it's different and incompatible. The number of copies that survive is not insignificant that have Cancer, likewise not insignificant that have Scorpio. We don't have a means of determining which one was thought to be right, but they both can't be right. We have no evidence, no scribal evidence, that anybody noticed it as a problem. No copies of this survive where a copyist or a reader added a note. I want to remind us that these texts are richly annotated in all sorts of ways, but in this instance, the readers are silent. Another astrological tenet, doctrine, is interplanetary aspects. And we have an example of what happens, or an example of this change. I don't have this, I wasn't going to overwhelm you with little bits of manuscripts. But two aphorisms, typically numbered 63 and 69, show us nicely how different aspects between planets were thought to be relevant. In one copy, we read, "Consider when Saturn is in conjunction with Jupiter, which of these prevails, which of those two planets has more authority, and forecast according to the nature of that one, and do the same thing for the remaining stars." In another copy, roughly the same age, 14th century, it says, "Consider when Saturn is in opposition to Jupiter, which of these prevails, and forecast according to the nature of that one," and so on for the rest of the planets. We see numerous such examples in these aphorisms of this switch, conjunction for opposition or opposition for conjunction. It's important to note, once again, this is an incompatible switch. Conjunction, when two planets are very close to each other, if you imagine the blank horoscope, conjunction would be when two planets find themselves in roughly the same spot on this chart. That's a reinforcing or positive position. That augments the influence of the planets in those signs. Opposition, as the name implies, when they are on the opposite sides of this chart, is a negative or destructive relationship. That undermines the influence of those two planets. We can't have it both ways. We can't have Saturn in opposition with Jupiter and something happening, and the same thing happening when Saturn is in conjunction with Jupiter. Again, sadly, our manuscripts are silent as to that being a problem. Another version of problems is when we have different planets. Here I'm going to look at a couple of 15th century copies, but I could pick across the board. And in particular, we have an example of an aphorism that switches out Sun and Mars. In a Vatican manuscript, the aphorism reads, "When the Sun happens to be with the head of the Gorgon, and not in aspect with a benefic, and no benefic is in the 8th house, and the ruler of the light of the condition will be in opposition to Mars or is square, the native will be beheaded. And if the light is at the midheaven, his body will be slain. But if the conjunction occurs in Gemini or Pisces, his hands and feet will be cut off." Kind of unfortunate. The other version of this begins by saying, "when Mars happens to be with the head of the Gorgon." Otherwise, the aphorism is largely the same. Couple of things I want to draw attention to. First, this is an incredibly precise, specific claim. When a planet, either the Sun or Mars, happens to be with the heterogorgon, not in aspect with a benefic, and no benefic is in the 8th house, house of death over here, and the ruler of the light of the condition will be in opposition to Mars or is square. This is remarkably precise language, picking out a very specific set of circumstances. We can't substitute Sun and Mars. These are two radically different planets. How do we make sense of this then? One of these two has to be wrong. If this is really an aphorism that picks out the way that the world works, they both can't pick out the same world. One final example that I'll draw attention to, and then try to pull some of these threads together, is a more generic, less specific, but more generic claim about the nature of the cosmos. In aphorism 86, we get a description of the way that the planets work. The Sun is the source of vital force, the Moon of physical, and Jupiter of growth, Mercury of reason, and Mars of desire. We see that with some regularity in these copies. In other copies, we see the Sun is the source of vital force, the Moon of physical, and Jupiter of growth, Mercury of reason, and Venus of desire. There are other copies that add a couple of other planets as well. But the important thing here is Mars cannot be the source of desire and Venus the source of desire. Moreover, as a rule, Mars was not thought to be the source of desire. Venus was linked to desire. Mars is the source of tension, of conflict, and of anger. So here we have a broad statement about the way the natural world is that is in tension. There are other examples that switch out both signs and planets. There's one that switches out Leo, the sign of Leo, and the sign of Libra, two radically different signs, and at the same time switches out the planets, the Sun and Mars. I want to repeat what I've said a couple of times now. These are workaday texts. They are in codices that are richly annotated. There are lots of spots that these very texts, these copies of astrological aphorisms, are annotated. We see corrections to spelling. We see corrections to word order. We see additions when pieces of phrases are missing. Yet in these cases where it seems to be a statement about the way the world works, there is no evidence that anybody noticed something wrong. Except in one instance. Well, no, two instances. And it's not clear that there's something wrong, but rather a copyist noted that there was a possible variation. In a late copy, a 17th century copy, the copyist, who seems to have a Latin translation at his disposal, probably very close to him, and a Greek version somewhere close by, under aphorism 75, which is the one that switches out Mars and the Sun and switches out Leo and Libra, the copyist wrote that some people say Sun for Mars, others say Mars for Sun. There's no indication that he thought one was correct. It's just a simple note. In another copy, late 16th century copy, in one instant, in that aphorism 75, in one instance of the place where we see the symbol for the Sun, somebody has written the symbol for Mars above it. But no indication that they thought it was wrong or right. They haven't crossed out the Sun. Where does this leave us? Well, I know it leaves you all desperate to buy a copy of Ptolemy's aphorisms because you're now wondering how you're going to go to sleep without them. I think it leaves us with a few puzzles. The first is, absent evidence that people saw there was a problem, I think we have to conclude that people in the past didn't sense a problem, that they were able to hold in their mind or in their sort of collective experiences different ways of imagining the world to work. We would be mistaken, I think, if we try to find the right version of these aphorisms or these collections of aphorisms. There isn't, I would suggest, a right or wrong version. There are lots of right versions. Moreover, we can't solve this problem. Most of us are not going to go out and try to determine whether or not a purge will work better when a particular planet is in Scorpio, or when the moon is in Scorpio, or when the moon is in Cancer. We don't have an vested interest in astrology working in that way. We don't have a reality against which to test these aphorisms. Moreover, most of us probably don't care. It's not like Copernicus's De Rev, where we think, how do we find the right version? There's a best version because we think that it somehow maps onto a reality that we share. Most of us probably don't think we share this reality. I also think it encourages us to be careful about what we as scholars do. How readily do we assume that there might be a right or wrong version? And how readily do we assume that we have access to that right version? And here, for perfectly justifiable reasons, we tend to think that right version is in a critical edition or a recently printed edition, something that's easy to get access to. So we should be careful about how we do what we do. But there's one more, perhaps more provocative claim that I want to conclude with. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everything I said is rubbish, because maybe my starting assumption is wrong. My starting assumption that aphorisms make statements about the way the world works, maybe that's not what they do. We have been led to think that about Hippocrates' aphorisms and Ptolemy's aphorisms and the other collections of astrological aphorisms, but maybe that was not their function. Maybe we have wrongly understood the aphorism in this early period because we've found evidence that the Latin version of Ptolemy's aphorisms is taught in the astrological curriculum, because we find copies of these aphorisms in traveling with other texts that we think are pragmatic. We know very little, in fact, about what aphorisms were doing and where they were doing it. And I've been thinking about the Greek version. In the Greek context, we don't have a university where we can say, this is where it was assigned. We can't locate the collections of aphorisms in that obvious and what we think of as unproblematic social and intellectual space, where we tend to want to see things as being real or not real. So maybe these aphorisms were not problematic because nobody took them to be statements about the way the world worked. It's our mistake. Again, it's our practice that needs to be revised. Thank you. I guess I should say mine, because none of you probably worry about aphorisms, and that's for the best.
Thank you, Professor Hayton, for that really interesting presentation. I now invite all our three presenters to come up here to the table so that they can take questions. There's going to be 2 mics circulating, and please raise your hand, and we'll get the mics to you.
Before I forget, what's the definition that you use of aphorism? Has to do with explaining the way things work?
So I try to avoid the definition of aphorism because there are lots of definitions and it becomes a quagmire. Descriptively, I think of aphorisms in the pre-modern period as statements of principle about how a body of knowledge works. And in the case of the Hippocratic and the Ptolemaic and collected astrological aphorisms, that system of knowledge tends to look like it's telling us about how the world works.
That's why we believe it. I mean, that was your last question, was maybe we don't get it. But also, my ignorance, what is a benefic versus a malefic?
So the planets were divided into good and bad planets, having good and bad influences. Malefic is the bad influences, things like Mars. The benefic is positive and beneficial influences, things like Jupiter. So
And that's, well, that was
yeah, that
upon,
yeah, yep.
category.
That's sort of one of these standard pieces of astrological tradition.
Please speak into the mic for the sake of our online participants.
Hi. I have one for Eleanor, one for Darin. The one for Eleanor is, and it goes to what you said about alternative semantic systems and non-linguistic, paralinguistic, right? Physiognomy being an attempt to bypass the language. Now, I know a little bit about Kabbalistic physiognomy. And what happens there is that essentially what a practical Kabbalist is doing is reading Hebrew letters on someone's foreheads, right? So the signs are not lines, they are actually letters of the Hebrew language. And it's completely textual. So I was wondering, if people like Cardano, who have some exposure to Kabbalah, have any familiarity with this particular tradition, and secondly, if you can think of other linguistic forms of physiognomy, and what it would do to your entire project. Now, the one for Darin, I am I'm curious about aphorism 21, and I'm curious about the Pisces, right? Because the moon in Scorpio versus the moon in Cancer is just a change of dignity, right? It's going from it's dignified in Scorpio, is at fault in Cancer. You can argue, sorry, the other way, right? But you can argue that the purge would actually work better if you change the dignity. Now, the moon in Pisces has no essential dignity, right? It's peregrine. Why would it have any influence on the way the purge works, and why is it there? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I don't know very much about Kabbalistic physiognomy, so that will be my disclaimer. You're absolutely right that there is a relationship between like the way that like linguistic thinking happens and this like act of inscribing on the body. I think there's a similarity in this period with like mnemonic texts, like texts that are teaching texts to encourage students to remember like aspects of Latin grammar, right? And they will do that by inscribing on the face or the hands different aspects of grammar and how they relate to each other and that kind of system. What's striking to me about the way that Cardano and Magini talk about the signs as things that can be coded as kind of letters that kind of could be arranged in a way that might represent like a word or a sentence, is that they're really attentive to like aspects of the character of the lines based in like color, length, depth, about what they observe, and are not talking about the relation to their own kind of like alphabet. So I don't know that that answers your question, but I'm still kind of thinking through some of these questions. So I would really love to talk to you about the Kabbalistic stuff especially. But yeah, the attention is to the subtle changes in arrangement and meaning of a sign. That signs come up over and over again. You can have kind of cross sign, and if you have several cross signs, that is a chain sign. And kind of codifying that, but always with an attention to like very subtle aspects of how the signs present themselves, whether they're red or particularly deep or whatever. So yeah, Thank you for your question.
Yeah, likewise, thanks for the question. And I think your question gets at something that I'm still struggling with, and I think most people who look at aphorisms should be struggling with, but have not, which is, how do aphorisms get created? In what space? You know, this glib claim that they are the distillation of lots of knowledge, it's not clear to me that aphorisms, in fact, do represent, as a rule, the distillation of lots of knowledge. So in the example that you bring up, you're absolutely right. The moon in Scorpio and the moon in Cancer, we can point to a difference, that an astrological difference is going to happen. Whereas the moon in Pisces, just with respect to the zodiac, the moon is sort of neutral in Pisces. And so it's surprising to see it in the detriment in the Scorpio-Pisces pairing is the surprising pairing. The Scorpio-Cancer pairing would be more surprising, but it never, Cancer never substitutes Pisces, it's always Scorpio. So.
Thank you for the wonderful talks. I have one question for Paola and one for Eleanor. Is that okay? Yeah. So, Paola, you ended your talk with a really memorable sentence: print did not guarantee truth, was not a guarantor for truth, but durability. And I could not help but think, and this is also inspired by Eleanor's last slide of the AI-driven physiognomy, which is really terrifying. But you know, in our current age, where it's not so much print and durability, but maybe social media and ubiquity or amplification in the digital age. And I'm sure you get this question about how do we think about perhaps specific examples of invented origin stories and how quickly they can circulate and multiply and be amplified. Where do you situate your story in sort of our current moment is the question I had. And for Eleanor, very quickly, the poetry versus, what was the other category? The certainty of poetry you mentioned. And I was curious if you had further sort of thoughts on the relationship of poetry and truth and certainty in that particular instance. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think I have very brief answer to that. And partly Eleanor answered already. So clearly I chose to focus on these cases in my book and in this talk because of the current moment. And the intervention is to show that it's not the technology that creates the hallucination, but it's the approach to the nature of knowledge and the lack of the crucial question, how do we know what we know, that should shape the way we absorb information, but it doesn't. We see these hallucinations in the print age. We don't need the web, we don't need the digital era. And scholars of the early modern period have shown the vast amount of hallucinations, the equivalent of hallucinations, because of print practices in the workshops where printers were trained to recycle, for example, illustrations that they had and applied those illustrations in a different context. I'm going to give you my favorite example we showed in an exhibition we had at Yale called Crafting Worldviews on Science and Art in Europe, 1500, 1800. This is a representation of a zebra that circulated in the late 17th century and through the 18th century in a Dutch work called The Gallery of the World. It's just illustrations of various cultures with their flora, fauna, etc. And so when it comes to the zebra, what you have is the textual description in the caption, and what you see is a horse with diagonal stripes. And so obviously this comes from two needs. One is the printers having to figure out how to create the zebra based on textual information, and then to translate into images the textual information that the printer received. And so you have this hallucination, is in all effect a hallucination. I think working and paying attention to these earlier moments in which we have the very same practices with different technologies helps us provincialize the emphasis on modernity and the present as the moment in which change really happens, and also to understand that we don't need to only to criticize or being critical of the technology, but also understand the very human practices that lead to certain uses. And so I think, to give the short version of this answer is, I love to work on these pre-digital processes that remind us of the present, because they show the importance of history, and in history in this broader sense of paying attention to the past to understand and position ourselves critically in our present. So thank you for that question. It's at the heart of what I do right now.
Okay, poetry. So in this period and in the academies, which is the kind of focus of my study, poetry is serving kind of several functions. One of them is a kind of a way to show off to your colleagues your kind of cultural kind of the qualities of you in a kind of cultural, social, moral sense. If you are able to perfect the form, the kind of Petrarchan form is the gold standard, then you show something by doing that in a social sense and a kind of exchange of poetry. There's also a process by which scholars start to use vernacular poetry in particular, which is so not Latin poetry, but vernacular poetry, and to make claims, which is, I think, connected to the broader claims about like the validity and value of the vernacular language itself, that these poems, the kind of gold standard of Italy, Petrarch, Dante, right, have Boccaccio, poems have just as much kind of conceptual, philosophical value in them, the vernacular poems, as both prose texts and Latin poems and prose texts as well. So you get these kind of long lectures and discourses about taking a sonnet and explaining the kind of very complex and often quite startling philosophical point or truth that it is contained within it. And this is common throughout the 16th century and well on into the 17th. But then the kind of groups that I'm looking at in Bologna are exchanging, the kind of academies are structured around a kind of quite like a university, like a problem that somebody then responds to, and then the next week there's a kind of continuation of this prose debate, oral prose debate, but often written down. At the same time, this is reflected in a very similar thing happening with poetry, where somebody would write a poetry and a poem and then respond. And these kind of map on pretty closely sometimes to the prose debate. And I think with these like kind of public disclaimers in the printed collections that, oh, it's only poetry, especially when they're dealing in their broader work with especially subjects of astronomical subjects, debates about Copernicanism even, in their manuscript kind of works and letters and stuff. Some of this poetry is potentially being used as a way to have those discussions in a print forum, or to talk about this knowledge in a print forum without kind of getting the ire of the censors, basically.
Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions, but we can definitely continue this conversation over the course of the day. I want to thank you all for this very engaging conversation, and one more round of thanks for our wonderful speakers.